Hey folks, welcome back to Marshall Business Matters. I'm Paul. Today we're talking about a very specific conundrum that was brought to me, or maybe a specific question would be a better way to phrase it. I had a good friend come and visit me a couple of weeks ago. We spent some time together, we trained together, and he actually taught a couple of classes here at my school. He's a martial arts instructor, and he shared with me when he was here that he was in the process of trying to transition out of his garage, where he runs a small club, he teaches about a dozen or so students, out of his garage and into a yoga school that is down the road from him, and he's developed some sort of relationship with that school owner. And he came to me and he said, what are some of the things that I should be thinking about? And so I thought it'd be a really good idea to shoot this video to talk about some of the swings and roundabouts of working out of somebody else's space and how you might transition into someone else's space when you're first getting started. Stay tuned to find out some of the pros and cons of working in someone else's space, and also the right way and wrong way to go about it. Okay, so as we've talked about on this channel before, most of martial arts schools in this country, the vast majority of the martial arts schools in this country are mom and pop operations, sole proprietorships or single owner LLCs that are the second income or second venture for the owners or managers. That is extraordinarily common. Upwards of 90%, in fact, of the martial arts schools in this country are operated that way. They're second ventures for the owners and operators. Many of these owners and operators are hoping to one day transition their martial arts club or martial arts school into their full-time source of income, but that's where they are today, the vast majority. We're actually taking it a step further back in this story because we're going one step further. We're saying this is somebody who's currently teaching out of their garage, which again, a lot of people do, and there's nothing wrong with it, and moving from the garage into a space. And that would actually be a pretty simple conversation, but the little caveat is not moving into their own space, not getting a lease and negotiating with a landlord for a space for a particular period of time for a certain dollar figure, but actually doing that within someone else's space. And I think I mentioned in the intro, a yoga studio. So what are some of the pros and cons of this? Well, the obvious pro is that if you are working within someone else's space, your overhead is going to be substantially lower than it would be if you were working within your own space. You are only going to be taking time in that space for a very limited section of the day, a limited segment of the week. And so you're only going to be out a very small figure compared to what you would be out if you were leasing your own space. The challenge with that scenario is that, as the old saying goes, their house, their rules. If you are in a situation where you're going to be working in someone else's lease space, then there are really only a couple of ways you can go about that. You can sublet in a specific function of time, a specific number of days, specific days out of the week, specific hours in the day, and say, during this period of time, this is actually my space. I am subletting this space that you are leasing. And during that time, the time that is incorporated within the spectrum of my contract, this is my space. And that's fine. There's a lot of schools that do that. There are a lot of martial artists I know who work out of yoga studios and dance studios, and there's nothing wrong with that. But you do have to remember the caveat, their house, their rule. If you're subletting, they basically get to call 100% of the shots. They get to say, these are the days you can, these are the days you can't, these are the hours you can, these are the hours you can't, and so on and so on and so on. And one of the big problems with that is that a big part of building a successful community in a martial arts school or a martial arts club is outside the floor experiences. Parents' night out. We talked about, I think, parents' night out in revenue streams and how events and community events like self-defense seminars, parents' night outs, parties, things like that can be massive, if not income generators, though they should, can be massive generators of camaraderie and spirit and togetherness and community for your school or your club. And so if you're subletting someone else's space, then you're constantly on the phone with that person to try and negotiate hours and days when you can do those sorts of things. And oftentimes the answer is going to be no, because they're running a business too, and they need their space during those hours and days. If they were going to be free during those hours and days, they probably would have included them in your sublease in the first place. So you're going to have that difficulty. Another difficulty is that typically most people who sublet to you are not going to be willing to do it for a very long period of time. We're talking a period of, say, 3 months, 6 months, 12 months. And then it's back to the negotiation table. Why? Well, they want to command top dollar for their space, obviously. Two, they don't exactly know necessarily what's going on in their own business on a long-term projection. And so while subletting to you might be a great way to boost their income in the short term, they're not necessarily going to want to commit to anything long-term, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, 10 years, something like that. That's not going to make a lot of sense for them because they might actually end up kneecapping themselves in terms of growth. So you're going to have that difficulty. So subletting a space is great because it lowers your overhead, but it's not so great because it really does limit your opportunities to grow. It limits your opportunities to adjust your own schedule. It limits your opportunity to run events and build spirit and community within your school. And it's limiting in the sense that you're going to constantly be back at the negotiation table with who is essentially your landlord, who's going to want either more money or is going to want to renegotiate the terms of times and days. Probably the lowest hanging fruit in terms of examples that I can use to showcase this in a real world scenario is community center martial arts programs. You go to any community center, any YMCA, any local community center, Boys and Girls Club, I can almost guarantee you that they're going to have a couple of martial arts programs. And when I say a couple, usually they've got 2, 3, 4, sometimes 5 different martial arts programs at these centers. And the problem that those martial arts programs have, and the reason that there's a lot of churn, a lot of turnover, not just in the student population, but also in the instructors, is because there's no consistency. Those community centers write 3, 6, and 12-month contracts with their program providers. And the administrator at those community centers sits down and reviews all of the different program providers, reviews what they brought in the previous quarter or the previous half year or the previous year, reviews the enrollments for those particular programs, and almost algorithmically, robotically figures out when prime time is, who's getting what time slots, how many days a week, and things like that. And so when you look at those martial arts programs that are hosted out of community centers, now some of them, they've been around for years and they've had a great relationship with their community center, been very successful, but the majority of them are fly-by-night. Maybe they've been around for 1 or 2 seasons. You have no idea if they're going to be around next season. And this can kind of happen to you, pulling back to the original conversation, this can kind of happen in subletting scenarios as well. Use this as an example. You go and you sublet a space, say a yoga studio or a dance school. You sublet, 2-3 days out of the week for a couple of hours of the day. These are not prime hours. And why do we know they're not prime hours? Because if they were prime hours, that yoga school or that dance school would be filling it with the mats with their own students, not yours. But let's say that you do make that arrangement. You negotiate, say, Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays from 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. Unlikely, but let's say that you do that. And then you've been at it and working hard and developing a student population, getting a strong base, and you've been at it for 4, 5, 6 months. And then all of a sudden you show up to the studio one day and you realize that the owners of the dance school haven't been paying rent. They're 3 months in arrears, and the landlord got tired of that. They came and stuck a lock on the door. Where does that put you? It puts you out on the street on your butt, just like it puts that dance studio out on the street, because you are subletting from them. You don't have a formal relationship with the person who actually owns the building. You only have a formal relationship with the person who is running the dance school. And so you don't really know what's going on behind the scenes there. So you're constantly subject to the swings and roundabouts of their business to determine whether or not your business can possibly be successful. So I think you probably at this point know where I'm falling on this, which is to say, best case scenario, you should not probably be subletting a space from a yoga studio or a dance school, because the worst case scenario is that you do so and you end up losing a lot of money, you end up losing a lot of credibility, and you end up gaining and then losing a lot of students or potential students. Now, if you are going to pursue that relationship, here are a couple of things that you definitely want to fall in line with. Number one, if it's not in writing, it doesn't exist. If it's not in writing, it doesn't exist. A verbal agreement and a handshake go nowhere in this world. You must get everything in writing. And the little stuff, the stupid stuff, like who's responsible for cleaning the toilets? Who's responsible for vacuuming the floor? Who's responsible if somebody forgets to lock the door or forgets to turn on the alarm? Who's responsible for the inevitable break-in and theft of all the iPads? Those are the kinds of things that you probably want an attorney to work out with the other business. You probably don't want to be making those conversations or making those negotiations yourself, simply because you're not going to be fully versed in all the right questions to ask. You're not going to be fully versed in industry standards, and you're not going to be fully versed in how to properly word things so that the contract that you eventually come to is actually enforceable under the law. But you have to have everything in writing. Everything has to be in writing. Number two, there are basically two ways that you can financially arrange for this. You can either have all of your students going through the yoga school or the dance school central billing and having the yoga school or the dance school pay you. In other words, your martial arts program becomes one of the programs that the yoga school or the dance school provides, and you are essentially a paid instructor for your own program. And that's a fine relationship. There's nothing inherently wrong with that relationship. And then the other way that you can do it is that you pay for the time and for the space. Really, however you decide to arrange that with your dance school or your yoga school or whatever. I keep saying yoga school, dance school, because that's the scenario that was presented to me. But I mean, there's any number of places that you might find cheer, gymnastics, yoga, dance. All of those things kind of exist within the same spectrum. Parkour gym. I mean, anything like that, you could probably find the space to run a little martial arts program. So, expand your horizons. And where was I? Yes. So we talked about the ways that you can set that up, making sure that everything is in writing. And then finally, you want to make sure that you're touching base with the person that you're working with. Touching base regularly, consistently, making sure that everybody's on the same page, and having actual conversations about the future. Because remember, they're not going to sign more than a 3, 6, 12 month on the high end sublease with you. They're just not going to do it. It kneecaps them. They're not going to do it. So you want to make sure that if you are in this relationship, after you've established this relationship, that you are consistently touching in with them, touching base with them, and reminding them about what your long-term goals are, and making sure that you are not a hindrance to their business, but actually you're working together to ensure success across the business lines. So that's it. That's really it. At the end of the day, probably wouldn't be my boat on the way to go. I see a lot of potential pitfalls, problems with subletting from a yoga school or a dance school or a parkour gym or whatever. There are potential benefits. And yes, it is a low-hanging fruit in terms of the amount of money that you'll save in overhead in getting started. If you were going to make that transition from garage to someone else's space, I would put it as a short-term goal to make the secondary transition of getting out of that space and into something of your own very, very, very quickly. Because the longer that you're under someone else's control, the less authority you have to make decisions for yourself and for your business that are right for your business's growth. That's all I got for you today. Thanks so much for watching. Remember, stay tuned for next time. Like, subscribe, and you watch Martial Business Matters, because Martial business matters. Take care.